Good morning. I am Tyler McCann, Chief Engagement Officer at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and I'm pleased to moderate today's dialogue. Thank you for joining us. While we are all meeting virtually, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the First Nations on whose traditional territories we sit as we watch our screens. CAPI's head office is in Ottawa, so I would like to recognize the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, whose traditional and unceded territory we would be gathered upon today. This is an important reminder of our connection to this land and the value of including all perspectives in on our conversation. We are excited to get the CAPI Big Solutions Forum Trusted Opinion Leaders pre-dialogue underway. But first, I would like to pass it over to Chantal Donahue, Chair of CAPI's Board of Directors, to say a few introductory remarks.
Thank you, Tyler. I would like to thank everyone in attendance today for participating in this important dialogue, for providing your valuable insights, and for contributing to the success of CAPI's Big Solutions Forum. I know many of you are familiar with CAPI, but I would like to take a few minutes to introduce the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute for those of you who may not be as familiar. CAPI is an independent policy think tank focused solely on the agri-food sector, bringing insight, evidence, and creative solutions to agri-food policymakers by creating venues for critical conversations, explaining research results to a broader audience, and being a connector between those who have creative ideas to contribute and those who are making impactful policy decisions. While CAPI was established 17 years ago, the work it does has never been more important. As you know, there are major opportunities and risks on the horizon. This past year has reminded us of the importance of the agri-food system that is resilient to disruption. We also need a system that can meet the increasing global demand for high quality food, and a system that enables us to do our part to tackle climate change. At the same time, we must set Canada's agri-food system apart in an increasingly competitive and complex global environment. We need to find new ways to drive growth through innovation, creative thinking, and ideas rooted in science and good policy. Canada has certain comparative advantages, but we cannot rest on our laurels. If we are to increase trade and international cooperation, we must build leverage and influence international rulemaking. We must find the untapped opportunities, grow and scale, attract investment in value-added processing, and create more sustainable value chains. Put simply, we must find a way to produce more and better with less. We can do this together at CAPI. But we can only do this together at CAPI if we have the right financial partners in place. It is through these partnerships that CAPI can continue to be the institution where Canada's agri-food system comes together to do bold, creative, strategic policy thinking, and an institution that produces groundbreaking content, critical connections, and bold communications, of which all are actionable, consumable, and timely. From the beginning, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has been CAPI's significant financial partner. We would not be here today without the significant investment from the department, and we are grateful for their continued support. However, as we move forward, a more diverse funding model is essential for CAPI to have a sustainable future. This new approach to financial partnerships will only be possible because of funders who believe in advancing the agri-food and agriculture sector, funders like you. There are many different ways to support the work of the Institute, as you can see listed here on the slide. And we are actively seeking funding partners on our work going forward. Your commitment is vital, and it is urgent for all of us to come together to intensify our efforts, as agriculture and agri-food can be an essential solution provider for the economy, environment, health, food, and global security. But creative policy changes are essential. Please reach out to Tyler or Janelle Bode, Director of Fundraising, to explore the different opportunities. We look forward to connecting with you. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Tyler.
Thank you, Chantal. Today will take place in 3 parts. First, we will hear from keynote speaker, Professor Christopher B. Barrett, followed by a period of question and answers. We will then take a brief health break. Following the break, CAPI's Chief Strategy Officer, Ted Bilyea, will provide a presentation that brings together the learnings from CAPI's research program, Creating Prosperity from Chaos. You will have all received a copy of this presentation in advance of today. It can also be found on the forum website in French and English. We will provide the link and password to access it in the chat box. The CAPI presentation will set the stage for the breakout group discussions in the final portion of today's event. The success of this forum will rely heavily on the active participation of all attendees in the breakout group discussions. And now I have just a few housekeeping items to review. The dialogue will be recorded, however, the individual breakout groups themselves will not be. And a reminder that to signal to ask a question, please use the raise hand function. I now have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Professor Chris Barrett, who will set the stage for our event. Chris Barrett is an agricultural and development economist at Cornell University. He is the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Professor of Applied Economics and Management and an international professor of agriculture at the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management, as well as a professor in the departments of economics and of global development and a fellow of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. Chris is co-editor-in-chief of the journal Food Policy, edits the Palgrave Studies in Agricultural Economics and Food Policy book series, co-edits the Elsevier Handbook of Agricultural Economics, volumes 5 and 6, and previously edited the American Journal of Agricultural Economics. His more than 350 publications have been cited more than 45,000 times. Over to you, Professor Barrett.
Thank you very much, Tyler, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for your interest in this topic and for inviting my presentation. It's a real honor to be with you. I'm going to speak today to summarize largely findings from a recent expert panel report, but I'm going to try to tease out a few key reflections for the Canadian community in particular. Keep in mind, I'm an American sitting just south of the border in upstate New York, but as a longtime observer of the Canadian agricultural economy, I think I have some insights from this work that could be useful, and I look forward to learning from you all in the breakout discussions. So just to summarize, the report that I'm going to be using as the core of this presentation was released in December. It's available on the Nature website. It was the 2020 expert panel convened by the journal Nature Sustainability, hosted by the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. The panel itself involved 23 experts. We added 10 additional expert co-authors. As you can see from their photos around the edge of this slide, it was a very diverse group from all across the world, a variety of disciplines, a wide range of organizations from large corporations and institutional investors to venture capitalists, to NGOs concerned with the environment or with humanitarian concerns, to folks coming from multilateral and government organizations, as well as researchers. So it really was summarizing expert opinion across a wide swath of the agri-food space globally. And the report is going to be released as a book a little later this year by Palgrave Macmillan. The core message really boils down to two things. First is that we have to hold two very fundamental truths in mind as we think about the agri-food system at any scale, whether it's locally or globally. As we look to its transformation going forward, we first need to acknowledge that the agri-food system has accomplished some remarkable transformation over the last 50 years. Think back to the 1960s and 70s, where there were widespread legitimate concerns of frequent famine. We had already experienced famine in many parts of the world, and human population growth was relatively rapid, and there were legitimate fears that the supply of staple foods, particularly basic grain, cereals, was going to not keep pace with population growth. And we would have recurring famine that could be destabilizing geopolitically, disruptive economically, and of course, tragic in humanitarian terms. So this sparked major agri-food system innovations. In this slide, this graphic is showing you what has happened over time in the large blue mass to the number of people who are not undernourished, for whom we have adequate dietary energy supplies. And the remarkable thing that is a direct product of agri-food system innovations that began in the 50s and 60s, enshrined in the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize to the wheat breeder Norman Borlaug, since that time, we've added on average about 90 million people per year to the ranks of those who get enough caloric intake every given day. So 10,000 people an hour. We've shrunk slowly, but we've shrunk the number of people not meeting that standard. As a result, the share of the population undernourished, meaning not enough dietary energy intake daily, has been steadily falling. It has plateaued in recent years and slightly ticked up, and certainly has increased further this year during the pandemic. But the first fundamental truth to hold firmly in mind is that we set about to try to expand the availability of staple foods to meet dietary energy needs 50 years ago, and we have succeeded fabulously, and that has benefited humanity dramatically. The second fundamental truth we need to keep in mind is those innovations have also had major adverse, unsustainable spillover effects. We've contributed significantly to global warming through the agri-food system. We've lost biodiversity and transformed water and land resources in ways that are not sustainable. There have been public health and nutrition consequences from an excessive focus on generating increased supply of calories, not enough attention to micronutrients or to the adverse consequences of overconsumption of calories. And there are social justice issues throughout the agri-food value chain globally. So what we should take away from those two fundamental truths is that we need to update our objectives as we think about agricultural and agri-food innovation. We must update those objectives to get beyond just a focus on increasing cereals productivity. And we can achieve the same remarkable things that were achieved half a century ago as we continue to innovate in the coming century. So the panel advocates for a focus now on 4 distinct but interrelated objectives, which we summarize with the mnemonic HERS. We need healthy food systems producing a range of healthy attributes focused much more on mineral and vitamin adequacy in intake rather than supply of calories, and healthy food free of pathogens and foodborne disease. Equitable value chains so that all people participating in the value chain, whether it's farmers and farm workers or those further downstream, food service workers, truckers, processors, that they have equitable, reasonable livelihoods, safe, protected from injury and illness, and earning enough so that their families too can afford healthy diets. Resilient to the shocks that increasingly rock the system, both climate shocks, disease shocks, disruptions to trade, et cetera, and sustainable. We only have one planet. We need to take much better care of her than we have been. So with those core objectives, the panel then set about thinking 25 to 50 years down the road. Note, we're not talking about the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are either achievable or unachievable based largely on technologies already in our portfolio. We don't have time to develop and scale up new technologies between now and 2030. Very few will get to impact. Most agri-food research generates scaled impact at 10 to 25-year horizons from initial R&D investments. So we were quite consciously focusing on that 25 to 50-year horizon where one could take emergent ideas and mature them, scale them to generate impact. So looking out 25 to 50 years from now, we need to be thinking about what are going to be the future states of the world between now and then, not what's the state of the world today. So in doing this sort of long range R&D sort of ideation, one needs to be thinking about foresight. One needs to be thinking about emergent properties of the system. And there are 3 big ones that need to be driving our thinking about agri-food system innovation. The first is climate change. Forgive the pun, but it's baked into the system now. We can do a lot to mitigate how much climate change is, but there is already enough enough atmospheric carbon and methane that we are going to see continued warming with all the disruptions that will bring. We need to be preparing for it better. Second, population shifts are likewise already baked in. Just the demography of today's populations tell us that populations will continue to grow worldwide before peaking a bit later this century, peaking probably in the 2060s, with a much greater concentration of urban populations than we see today, and population increasingly concentrating in Africa, as most of the North Atlantic and North Pacific communities are already near peak population and will begin seeing a shrinkage in their populations in the years ahead. Income growth is the other crucial thing that is going to drive the agri-food system. We will and hope to see continued income growth, especially in today's low and middle income countries. And that income growth will continue to be concentrated largely in those countries. Together, those three big drivers have two core implications. The first is we need to be paying far more attention to Africa. Africa is the region of the world that is most likely to suffer serious consequences from climate change. It will have by far the largest population growth and likely the largest aggregate income growth. And it is the only major world region that right now remains predominantly rural, but that is changing fast. So more than 50% of global food demand growth between now and 2100 will be happening in Africa. Saturated mature markets in the North Atlantic and North Pacific regions are not going to create much new opportunity for sales for agri-food suppliers. That future market is overwhelmingly concentrated in Africa. By some parameterizations, Africa could easily account for 70 to 75% of marginal growth in food demand to 2100. And the second point that I would offer for this audience is Canada is actually relatively favored by these big three trends. That Canada's agri-food system could actually benefit from climate change in ways that many other regions won't. So there are some net agronomic gains to be had with longer seasons and somewhat warmer climate. Second, you have the land for a post-agricultural rural economy, a point I'll come back to in just a moment. And third, Canada's bilingual nature gives it a big advantage in Africa compared to most other major agri-food exporters. So the last key conclusion we have is that we are not starved for technologies. The pipeline of emergent natural and social science-based advances that are at various stages of deployment readiness is absolutely huge. So these span geographies, they span value chains. We spend 60 pages enumerating details of these in the expert panel report. I won't belabor them now, but the point is that it's not that we have insufficient numbers of really exciting individual technologies. The crucial thing, the most essential action we all at all levels need to take is to develop bundles of those technologies. No single technology solves a problem. We must bundle them, and we must bundle them across the science and engineering based innovations along with social policy cultural innovations. We need to bundle for three big reasons. The first is to realize synergies. So think of the Green Revolution lessons. For those unfamiliar with the Green Revolution, it's the term used to summarize the advances in plant breeding and associated agricultural inputs that began in the 60s and 70s that was associated with, indeed directly caused, this massive improvement in dietary energy supply worldwide over the last half century. So the Green Revolution was sparked, many people say, by improvements in plant breeding, especially in rice, wheat, and maize. But think about what really happened there. It wasn't just that, let me focus on rice for a moment. It wasn't just that breeders at the International Rice Research Institute and its partner National Agricultural Research Systems developed IR8 and IR64, these amazing varieties that doubled, tripled, quadrupled rice yields in Southeast and South Asia, and then propagated to generate all the modern varieties cultivated in the high income world today too. It was that they were accompanied by extension services and irrigation infrastructure, government policy, including policy to train next generation scientists to be able to adapt those rice varieties. Think about what has happened with the more recent rice genome innovations associated with golden rice, arguably a more impressive scientific advance in changing rice genetics than were IR8 or IR64, the varietal innovations a half century earlier. But golden rice is yet to be produced in commercial open production anywhere in the world more than 20 years after its discovery, because it has lacked the accompanying bundled support systems to enable it to adapt and scale. We need good varieties, we need good fertilizer blends, we need good robots, but we need them to be accompanied by all the ancillary supporting innovations, especially in the policy and cultural space. That leads to the second reason why we need bundling of different innovations, and that is the complicated political economy that comes from spillover. So golden rice is another good example. Golden rice has the potential to enable rice to provide enough provitamin A, enough beta carotene for poor people consuming relatively narrow diets heavy in rice to get adequate vitamin A intake to prevent vitamin A deficiency and associated nighttime blindness, xerophthalmia, et cetera. Similar lessons come from the current debates raging in the United States around alternative proteins, around plant-based substitutes for meat products, where you have this tremendous battle over whether these can be called meat. So those are not debates about the technology or the potential of the technology to, for example, provide much more climate-friendly protein supplies than the present systems we use in the United States. Rather, it's really about the political economy of the harms that are going to be caused in the creative destruction process that inevitably attends technological innovation. The third reason so there are possibilities for bundling methods to keep people whole. I live in a dairy farming community just north of Ithaca, New York. The community here is threatened by alternative proteins because their livelihoods depend upon livestock. There are ways of keeping those communities whole by supporting the emergence of alternative revenue streams for dairy farmers and feed crop producers. The other reason we need bundling is there are heterogeneous needs. One technology rarely solves all the problems. This is something we've learned in spades in addressing vitamin and mineral deficiencies, micronutrient deficiencies, that we need to promote diverse diets. So we need to work on nutritional education with caregivers and those who do shopping and food preparation so that they select and provide nice, diverse diets. But we also benefit from industrial fortification. So providing folic acid in flour so that women of childbearing age have adequate folates to protect their unborn children. We need adequate biofortification of basic crops. So things like golden rice can work. The orange fleshy sweet potato is a nice innovation that's really helping. But no one of these solves the problem. We need them together. We need bundles. This leads to one of the most essential areas for bundling, and that is our need to reduce the land and water footprint of the foods we consume. We, a century ago, began to decouple food production from manual labor. Mechanization was somewhat unthinkable. 125 years ago, if you had approached farmers and asked them, can we grow enough food without people working the land with horses and oxen? And they would have told you you're crazy. And yet today, you find relatively little animal and human power going into the most productive agricultural economies history has ever seen, especially those in places like Canada and the US. We are on the cusp of a similar substitution of capital for land. We are increasingly able to produce high quality food on a competitive cost basis in vertical agriculture, like you see in the central photo here, that comes from a simple indoor farming operation in India that turns a profit without government subsidy. We are seeing alternative proteins, like you see in the right-hand graphic, where one can produce through precision fermentation something that is rather similar to ground beef, with a much lower footprint on land, water, and climate. A crucial part of that, though, is facilitating transitions for feed crop producers and livestock producers, even for vegetable producers who will be threatened by these emergent technologies. We need to provide revenue streams through things like agrophotovoltaics. Land is the central thing we need for siting solar power, geothermal power, and wind energy sourcing. So farmers have the capacity to switch from farming feed crops to farming energy. Similarly, for storing carbon, right now we lack adequate mechanisms to provide sufficient incentive to facilitate those transitions and overcoming the major fixed costs many farmers face in making those transitions. So the challenge is managing the creative destruction associated with de-agrarianization, with decoupling food production increasingly from the land. Canada, again, has some advantages here, both in terms of the technologies Canada has, as well as the land, sunshine, and wind resources it can harness to really accelerate some of those transitions in ways many other places, including much of the US, cannot. So we need to be reconfiguring public support for agri-food systems. I won't belabor this, but there are basically two roles for government. One is to invest in essential public goods and services, like in the US, National Science Foundation funded research, or Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada funded research. But the other is to facilitate dialogue, to facilitate finding cooperative solutions, bundling together innovations that can work to make sure that everybody is kept whole, and together we can transform the food system towards these HERS objectives. So workshops like this are valuable. As you all know, there's huge amount of waste right now in government agri-food system spending. Globally, we spend $2 billion a day on agri-food subsidies right now, most of it not spent very wisely, most of it not spent on those two key roles. So we can redirect and should redirect much of this, but that's going to take adequate civil society dialogues. You have to identify contextually appropriate bundles the government can support with the funding that it will continue to provide. And again, Canada here seems to have some advantages over many other of the major agricultural economies around the world. There are several other essential actions the expert panel report presents. I won't go through those in any detail. You can go check out the expert panel report if you're interested in more on these. But again, Canada has some latent comparative advantage because a central piece to many of these things, whether it's novel financing, deconcentrating power, comes down to trust. It comes down to whether you can convince people that product attributes you claim are indeed true. So can you comply with environmental social governance concerns, ESG concerns? Can you produce healthful foods, and will people believe you? These are things where Canada has a reputation as an honest broker around the world. You can take advantage of that opportunity. So let me just close with two challenges that I think the Canadian agri-food community faces. The first is relatively little post-harvest value addition. So Canada is a tremendous producer of raw commodities, basic commodities, some of the most cost competitive providers of everything from dairy to wheat, but doesn't do nearly as much as other high income countries to add value to those commodities. Globally, work that several of us have in press, I've got to correct proofs for the journal later today. Nature Food will be publishing the first global study of how consumer food expenditures break out across the value chain. And what we find is that 73% of consumer food expenditures on food away or food at home, so what you purchase at the grocery store to bring home to eat, 73% of that accrues post-harvest. It accrues to all the value chain actors after the farm. And in food away from home, it's 91%. Only about 9 cents on the dollar spent when people eat away from their homes, only about 9 cents of that is accruing to farmers. And that share for farmers is going to continue to shrink. The post-harvest share will continue to grow. You see on the left the time series of what's taken place in the United States. What is the cent per consumer food dollar expenditure in the United States that accrues to farmers? On the right, you see the plots for individual countries between 2005 and 2015. Those shares are small and shrinking. You've got to get into value addition in a more serious way to take advantage of the changes that are coming. And the changes are coming mainly in the developing world. Connecting to food retail and food service transformation in low and middle income countries is an absolutely essential piece of a strategy to really be an active part of the agri-food transformation that is about to take place. It's already underway in these places. Here you see on the left, the annual average real rate of growth in sales by grocery chains in the developing world. And on the right, you see the annual real rate of growth in sales by multinational food service chains, so restaurants. These are astounding rates of growth. People have not yet fully noticed how fast the transformation of Asian, Latin American, and African food value chains is taking place. We have this work in a forthcoming article. These are major outlet opportunities. These are consumer-facing transformations, which is where the value addition and the trusted branding really pays off. Commodity trade is not the path into these chains. It comes through foreign direct investment, partnerships, and branding. So these are really the keys to market expansion. So just to summarize, we've seen dramatic transformations of the agri-food system in the past, and we must see them going forward. It's needed, it's essential, and it's inevitable. But to do this effectively, we need to be bundling social and technological changes. Canada has some natural advantages from geography, from culture and bilingual systems, from its reputation. Canada can take advantage of this, but it also faces some challenges that I suspect your discussions today are going to be tackling. So with that, for those who are interested, all of the materials that I was talking about get linked on this one site at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. I'm very happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that presentation. And so we'll now move to the Q&A discussion with our participants. Participants, we're asking you to raise your hand to ask a question. You can do that if you click on the participants tab at the bottom and go to the bottom of the list. There's a raise hand option there. So we'll ask you to do that, and then I will call on participants. The host will unmute you, and you'll have the opportunity to ask Professor Barrett your question. If you would prefer, you can type your question into the chat, but we do want to encourage interaction, and so we would recommend that you raise your hand that's there. Professor Barrett, if I can ask you to stop screen sharing too, please, that would be helpful. And again, so please take the opportunity to raise your hand or put your question into the chat box. I'll use my moderator's prerogative to ask a first question, maybe a simple one. Chris, when you look at the 7 essential actions that you've put forward, what do you see as the major barriers in place to implementing the policies needed to deliver on them? What's standing in the way of us getting to acting on these 7 essential actions?
Really, the crucial part here is the political will to come together for cooperative solutions. Again, this is part of where I think Canada has some comparative advantage. The winner-take-all psychology that is increasingly prevailed in many of our political systems, but also in our commercial systems, is ultimately an impediment to real advances here. And the reason is this: nobody has all of the pieces of the puzzle that we need. You may have noticed that the icons we use in the expert report are of teams putting together pieces of puzzles. That's the challenge we face. This is an incredibly complex system. Agri-food systems, people need to understand everything from the logistics and the marketing back to the basic agronomy and feedbacks and very complicated natural systems. Nobody has a grasp of that, and nobody can control the system. You know, it's not, sometimes when people talk about systems, people immediately jump to assumptions that you could optimize the system. There is no global optimizer out there. This is a network of billions of people making independent decisions multiple times a day. It really requires leadership that's willing to bring people together to talk about what are each group's objectives and how can we achieve compromise solutions that will let us move forward. There's way too much effort expended on adversarial attempts at winning all the games, and that ultimately holds us back. It's much more a question of political will than it is of technological expertise.
Great, thank you. Appreciate those insights. So we'll now go to a question. So Edmund, can you unmute Rory McAlpine? Rory, we'll go to you for your question next.
Great, thanks, Tyler. Well, Professor, actually, you were onto the issue I wanted to ask in what you just said. The question, you talk about socio-technical bundles as the solutions. And so, yeah, how do we change governance models to actually bring together the actors? Like, it feels like we've got a system in government that's highly siloed. We've got, as you say, independent economic actors in the sector that are maximizing profit and may therefore not be thinking of the total system. I mean, do you have any more concrete suggestions on how we're going to reform this? I guess it's that notion of mission-driven capitalism that's got to be embedded in the leadership of the sector, but in a sector that fights for margin every day so intensely, do you think that's really possible? Thank you.
Yeah, so I do think it's possible. I think it's possible because the primary producers and the manufacturers we had in the panel and the many we spoke with are all trying to do this. Now, they are certainly not representative of all producers and manufacturers, but there's a bigger community of people who really are looking for that mission-driven capitalism, as you referred to it. The question is whether we empower them or not. So let me give you an example from the US Farm Bill community. So in the US, we have distinct commodity groups that lobby for payments or various forms of support. It could be through subsidized crop insurance. And they often see this as a zero-sum game, that every dollar spent on the other guy is a dollar that's not going to come to me. And that sets us up for problems with the political process of coming to agreements that are viable. This is going to differ across every different system, by the way. So the panel very expressly eschewed trying to identify very specific socio-technical bundles because they depend so much on context. So in the context of the United States and the upcoming Farm Bill negotiations, for example, I would argue that getting rid of some of the commodity subsidies that are both distortionary in global markets, help to contribute a little bit to some of the imbalance we have in food supplies that leads to relative food prices that help consumers make bad dietary choices. But helping farmers to make the transitions will depend upon both the major buyers, the processors, manufacturers, and retail chains starting to set standards that they enforce. And they are doing that increasingly. So if farmers are expected to be able to demonstrate soil health, they're expected to be able to demonstrate that they pay their workers a living wage in order to be able to sell into this particular value chain, then they have an incentive to do that. If farmers are only eligible for subsidized crop insurance, if they are setting aside adequate marginal lands to help conserve soil and water resources and habitat for migratory waterfowl or butterflies or whatever you like, then they have an incentive to do that. Right now, we don't couple these things in ways that create the right incentives for people to choose what is ultimately in the social good. This is, in economics terms, we refer to these problems as externalities problems. What producers are doing and processors are doing, even what we consumers are doing, have spillover effects, have externalities on other. And it's the role of government to create mechanisms that induce us to choose things that not only help ourselves, but help those around us so that we have positive rather than negative externalities. This can be done, but it takes government that is committed to bringing people together to find solutions, not just to gain and secure power. And it takes companies that are willing to look to the long run. It's not an accident that many of the companies that are being most progressive about these things are privately held, that they're not publicly traded, having to meet quarterly returns targets for shareholders prepared to throw out management just if their 3-month, 6-month profits aren't adequate. We've got to start changing the incentives. It comes from leadership being focused on long run, internalizing externalities.
Great, thank you. So we've got a question in the chat, and this had come in earlier. I think you touched on it briefly, but this is from Susan Woodbohm. Can you speak? Can you give some examples of innovation bundles that offer the best opportunity?
Sure. So, for example, I do a lot of work in the drylands in northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia. That's kind of one of the focal geographies for my research group. So that is an area where climate change is taking a great toll. We're seeing more frequent, more severe droughts with human population growth, available grazing range and year-round water resources are increasingly scarce. So how do we manage that system for that population? Well, it comes from a combination of several things. One is some improved range management methods. So to help to maintain and regenerate grasses in the rangelands faster. So part of that is reversing policies that are counterproductive. The Ethiopian government for many years banned the burning of bushland. So, if you don't burn off the woody species, it outcompetes the grasses. And after a while, you're hurting the rangelands and hurting the productivity of livestock. So part of that is bringing in improved management of the natural resource base. Part of it was we developed a financial product, a drought insurance product that could remove some of the localized drought risk and push it into global capital markets. So European reinsurers would provide payments to Ethiopian and Kenyan cattle and camel herders when droughts hit their area to help offload some of that risk. That can be a profitable commercial product for the insurer, but it removes catastrophic downside risk from that area. In doing that, it also changes how those herders manage their herds. They are willing to invest more in, for example, simple preventative veterinary care. They are willing to invest more in managing rangelands. So you also need to work on activating better veterinary supply systems into that area. And you need to take care of some of the problems with tenure management. But the suite of innovations, some of them are financial innovations, some of them are natural resource innovations, and there's a lot of breeding work going on for improved cattle breeds for resistance to particular diseases, especially those that flare up when things are dry. That bundling is very appropriate to that specific context. The right bundle for the Canadian prairie is going to be radically different, but it takes people who know something about that system coming together to develop the right suites of innovations to help resolve problems in those settings.
Great, thank you. Edmund, we'll go to Renee Van Acker. Renee, for your question, please.
Thanks very much, Professor Barrett, for your presentation. In listening to you, I was wondering whether for countries like Canada and the US and other countries as well, is there a risk that our colonial perspectives might be a challenge for us, might be a problem for us? Will we be blindsided because of that by countries leapfrogging us in terms of technology development in agriculture and food?
I thought your question was going a slightly different direction, but I agree this is a concern in two different ways. One is hubris, that we can think we are better than we are and get blindsided by those developing better technologies elsewhere, which can include not just better engineering, better genomic material, and that's a very real risk. The strongest national agricultural research systems in the world right now are not in North America. The strongest national agricultural research systems in the world are arguably China and Brazil. So they've been generating new material, new discoveries around natural resources management, even post-harvest processing and manufacturing advances at a rate that far outpaces that of the US or Canada. So the second piece of your question, which I interpret as being around beware of hubris, beware of thinking that just because we're comparatively wealthy, therefore we must be better scientists, just not true. But the first part about a kind of a colonial tradition or colonial mindset is a slightly different question, and I think also a very real risk. So I emphasize the need to pay much more attention to Africa because that's where the markets are going to be. That's also where a lot of the social problems will be if we don't adequately attend to agri-food system transformation. But the right approach to that is not therefore send a bunch of money to Cornell University for me and my students to go spend tons of time working in Africa. The right approach there is let's help African institutions, public and private sector, to develop the capacity to diagnose and solve their own problems. Sure, let's provide them with technical backstopping. Let's provide them with financing necessary to be able to get them started when they lack resources right now. But the approach should not be and must not be getting outsiders who don't have a long run vested interest and don't have a deep understanding of local context, of local biological context, as well as cultural context, and don't have the same credibility. We really need to be investing much more heavily in developing a cadre of private sector leaders and scientists in the global South. I think one of the most tragic turns of the past 20 years in the donor community is the massive reduction in investment in training young people from Africa and Asia in our systems of higher education. It is losing us friends, and it is cutting off the capacity, the local capacity to develop this sort of adaptive and innovation capacity that is necessary in Africa in particular. So that's what I see as the real risk of a colonial mindset is, we think we're superior, therefore we should be the ones doing the hard thinking. And it's just, we don't recognize our own severe limitation.
Great, thank you. So a question from Don McCabe in the chat. Why will bundling solve the problems of the next 50 years using the same framework of today? Why would bundling solve current political, social, and profit-driven individuals?
I'm not sure I'm fully following the question, but let me hazard a short answer and then please tell me if I've drifted way off topic. So it's not so much that bundling will address or will solve a problem of excessive focus on profit. People are motivated, businesses are motivated by profit because that's the primary metric that they have for performance, and people naturally would prefer more resources to less. The question is, how do we direct incentives so that people who are pursuing profit will do so without causing harm to others? So what are the regulatory expectations we have? What are consumer behavioral responses to companies that pursue profit at grave cost? And this is where bundling comes in. Bundling is a matter of attending to the multiple needs of the system, that you can't reduce the performance of the system to the profitability of the companies that make it up, just as we can't reduce the performance of the system to the per capita supply of calories we're producing. If we have multiple objectives, we need multiple tools. And so we have to bundle them together to solve these problems. So will bundling automatically solve all problems? Absolutely not. But I can't imagine any path to really confronting the serious challenges we face that relies upon single institutions or single technologies or innovations. So bundling is necessary, but far from sufficient.
Great, thank you. So Edmund, we'll go to a question now from a participant, Bruno Larue. Over to you for your question.
First of all, thank you for your presentation, Chris. When you talk about cooperation between nations, it's something that is very difficult, even between friendly countries like Canada and the United States. At the international level, what kind of role do you see the WTO play in this sort of a new world where we have to be concerned about where food is produced to lower externalities? And how do you think the WTO should change to address this challenge?
Bruno, that's not a simple question, as you well know. WTO is absolutely essential. Multilateral organizations that provide a forum for discussion and for resolution of disputes are essential to be able to build trust that people will indeed abide by their agreement. So the most crucial part of the WTO is its dispute resolution mechanisms. Those need some tweaks. I won't get into the weeds on that right now, but we've seen that the dispute resolution mechanisms have teeth, but they sometimes can be both slow and manipulated. Probably the biggest problem we have with the WTO is the WTO was developed in an era where we were concerned mainly about import restrictions. We were concerned mainly about countries whose governments would limit the importation of food from other places. But since 2008, we've discovered that export bans are at least as big a problem. So it's more government interference with market mechanisms in a disorderly way. And I emphasize the disorder of government interference. Not that governments shouldn't intervene in markets. Governments must intervene in markets to address externalities. But how we do that really requires dialogue and cooperation. The WTO can facilitate that. You know, we've seen with the sad episode between my own country, between the US and China, you know, that bilateral big man negotiations are not terribly effective. The WTO provides a somewhat more subdued opportunity for more constructive and more evidence-based dialogue. It's far from a perfect solution, and there are institutional tweaks that can make it better. But we really need to set about rehabilitating the WTO, focusing in particular on refinements to its dispute resolution mechanisms and on incorporating basic disciplines around export as well as import-oriented restrictions.
Great. Thank you. We'll go to a question from the chat. This is a question from Glenn Fox. He says, Professor Barrett, one of the points in your presentation is that there's a system of agricultural subsidies that are a waste with respect to the policy agenda that you recommend. What is the path forward to dismantling that subsidy regime? Is this necessary to advance the policy agenda that you recommend?
Yeah, great question, Glenn. So let me emphasize, I'm not talking about dismantling the subsidy regimes, not least of which because I think that's a political non-starter in places like the US and China and the EU. Rather, it's changing the subsidy regimes. Right now, we are subsidizing things that create negative externalities. Let's alter those to subsidizing things that generate positive externalities. So let me give you examples. So in the United States, and I'm going to talk about the US just because I know the details of this case. I suppose you have some analogs in Canada, although far less egregious in magnitude. In the United States, we are implicitly subsidizing harvesting of carbon in topsoil in a variety of areas through different procurement programs and crop insurance programs. We should just be coupling increased investment in our conservation reserve program, that we encourage farmers to take the more marginal lands that right now they're doing the greatest damage to and set those aside, rest the land, provide habitat for waterfowl and other species by providing payments, because the conservation has a positive externality for society. We are reducing carbon loss, we're reducing emissions from farming, especially from farmers who are tilling already fragile soil. We're providing habitat for threatened species. Those are positive externalities. Pay farmers to provide that service. Provide subsidies to help farmers to acquire the capital necessary to convert to farming geothermal and solar and wind. You know, when my wife and I purchased into a solar array, so our home is you know, we're on the electricity grid, but we own solar arrays that generate on average the entire kilowatt throughput that we consume. So those aren't available in the same way for commercial scale enterprises. So if we want to see farmers using their lands to help us provide more renewable energy into the grid, so we reduce our dependence on hydrocarbons and we reduce the future damages that we're going to be paying for climate associated problems, then rather than paying tomorrow, pay today. You know, pay farmers, provide the same sort of subsidy that my wife and I got to buy into a solar array, provide similar sort of subsidy, whether it's for solar or geothermal or wind, to help farmers diversify their income sources and help them make the capital conversion. Farmers, at least in my community, aren't terribly liquid. They may have a reasonable balance sheet in terms of assets, but you know, they're lumpy assets with not very liquid markets. So being able to put a digester in for handling the gases coming off from the waste lagoons, or being able to put in solar panels in significant volumes or a small scale wind turbine even, that's not cash on hand. And those aren't even loans that are very easy to get from the farm credit agencies, because these are pretty risky assets for these farmers. We can just convert the existing subsidies from ones that are doing damage by incentivizing behaviors with negative externalities to providing subsidies to keep farmers and manufacturers whole, but incentivize behaviors that are good. Food reformulation is another good example. Right now, we implicitly are subsidizing manufacturers to use an awful lot of basic starchy sugars when we could be incentivizing them to reformulate foods in healthier directions. So this doesn't require shutting off the spigot, which is politically very difficult to do. It just requires directing the resources in ways that nudge recipients towards things that make the system sustainable and healthier.
Thank you, Chris. We've got a couple of questions in the chat we'll try and deal with before we wrap up. So I'm going to combine two of them. So the first question is, how and where do you see a role for soil-based agriculture? Do you believe countries should aim to move beyond it? And then a second question on a similar vein is, you showed some interesting examples of decoupling land use from food production. What are the critical inputs and support systems that need to be in place and have perhaps been successful elsewhere to support these transitions to cellular or vertical agriculture? Have you seen some good examples?
Yeah, so the transitions in all of these spaces towards reduced footprint on land, decoupling food production from land, the transitions are happening incredibly quickly. The part of that is technological advance. Just the improvements in fermentation methods are enabling the production of plant-based substitutes for meats. The improvements in cellular meats, the basic tissue engineering, providing the scaffolding needed to grow tissue from cells rather than start at the other end, growing an animal and reducing it to its tissues. Those advances are phenomenally fast right now, and they're on the cusp of paying off. We're already seeing that with things like Omni and Beyond and Impossible. Their phenomenal growth rates are a testimony to the fact that they're increasingly cost competitive. When I went to the grocery store a few weeks ago, the price of ground beef was only 10 cents per pound less than the price of the substitute available from a plant-based fermentation product. Just amazing. We couldn't have imagined these being competitive price points. We're seeing vertical agriculture, if anything, excites me even more, not because it's going to have as much impact on climate. The big gains from cellular meats or from plant-based meats are really going to be in reducing the nitrogen use and the carbon losses in the life cycle. So they're mainly climate and to a lesser degree environmental gains from those. But the health gains that are going to come from vertical agriculture, the ability to produce high quality vegetables and fruits much nearer to increasingly urban populations at a competitive price point, that's what can change diets, especially for the poor. One of my former students here at Cornell, a relatively young man still, he and his brother started a company in India. They grew up in India, providing low-cost, high-quality greens to cities in India. They were turning a profit within 24 months. They've now franchised their operation to several different cities in India and elsewhere in Asia, so Kuala Lumpur and Seoul, at least one other place that I'm drawing a blank on right now, where they provide the basic growing stock and kind of the simple technology, the architecture of their designs and the basic management practices on a franchise model. They're demonstrating that they can make money and serve what is very much a middle class market in growing Asian cities with high quality greens that otherwise weren't available. This is going to be an increasingly replicable, scalable model. We're seeing here in New York State, we're seeing broccoli growers are starting to compete with California growers and Southern Hemispheric growers through greenhouse operations. And that contributes to low cost, high quality, safe product available year round on local markets for families that otherwise aren't eating as diverse a diet as they could. That's the future. So we're almost there. It's happening quickly. The key is going to be managing the fallout from it and maximizing the gains, helping to facilitate healthier products coming out of that system, and to make sure that that system doesn't lead to, communities in rural areas that are really struggling because the feed crop revenue they relied upon, or the dairy byproduct revenue they relied upon, is gone, and now school systems are dying and farmers are going under.
And so, kind of building on some of those comments and about what's needed, a question from Brian Bedard: can you suggest some possible incentives which will motivate key players in the agri-food sector to overcome their vested competitive self-interests and engage in bundling?
Yeah, well, some of this is increasingly being driven by relatively long-range investors. One of the things that most surprised me in the expert panel is when we spoke with a variety of investors who have time horizons of 5 to 10 years. They are willing to start pressuring the management of companies in which they invest to address these problems, because they see serious risk of stranded assets and serious risk of catastrophic loss from especially climate-related and things like pandemic zoonoses. They see catastrophic risk that is just unacceptably high now, and they're looking to manage that downside tail of their returns distributions. So the investors, they, in some cases, are getting out ahead of the governments in forcing better behavior, which is somewhat astonishing, but it's true. And certainly not all investors. Those looking for short-term returns are just looking to milk the system. But those who are looking at 5 and 10-year horizons increasingly recognize that, pandemics are bad for everybody's returns, or you should expect it to be bad for everyone's returns. Some will win, but we only know who ex post. So you need to manage that. They're increasingly disciplining managements to get them to start focusing on these broader concerns. And part of the challenge and part of the responsibility, frankly, is for those of us in education. I teach in a business school, and there's a palpable change in today's business students at an elite place like Cornell. 20 years ago, when I was teaching business students, they were really focused on how do I get to Wall Street and make a lot of money. This generation is much more focused on how do I make a good income, but how do I also change the world in a way that I'll be proud to tell my grandkids about it. That difference is something we really need to cultivate and help to nurture. And a lot of that starts in universities.
Right. And so for our last question, I'm going to touch on something that came up during our trade and climate change virtual dialogues that we hosted with the Farm Foundation at the beginning of April. But it gets to a question maybe about governments getting out in front, but forgetting about the bundling and pulling it all together. The question is from Lynn Forte, and she asks, can you talk about the Brussels effect, or how the EU Green New Deal approach factors into the future and bundling?
Yeah, so I think the jury's out. We're going to see what happens. I like the spirit of some of the recent European innovations. A lot more effort on making sure consumers understand the range of attributes of their products, much more investment in incentives for growers and for processors and manufacturers to exhibit some of the sorts of good behaviors that I've been talking about. But it's still very early days. And as with so many things around European agricultural policy, it's terribly complicated. So just as in the early days of CAP, many people did not anticipate some of the byproducts of the common agricultural policy, I'm sure there will be some unanticipated consequences of the recent EU initiatives. We just don't yet know what they are fully, so time will tell. But I'm encouraged by this, and I think the Europeans, frankly, are well out ahead of the US in helping to chart more sensible, holistic, and sustainable food systems that deliver healthier, safer foods for consumers.
So appreciate your comments on that. So I think that's a note to end our discussion on. Again, I thank you for the participants for the questions. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation and the answers. I think that's lots for us to think about. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break now, and we'd like to ask everybody to come back. I guess a 13-minute break. It's 12:07 on my clock. We'll start Ted's presentation at 12:20. And so everybody's got 10 minutes. We'll see you back at 12:20 for the next phase of our today's session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. We will now be moving into the second part of the Trusted Opinion Leaders pre-dialogue. Next up, we will hear from Ted Bilyea, our Chief Strategy Officer at CAPI. He will present on CAPI's work program to prepare for the breakout group discussions. Please note that if you would like to view this presentation in French, you can simply click on the View options at the top of the Zoom window and select Français. Over to you now, Ted.
First, I'd like to thank Chris for his presentation today, because I think it helps us very much. CAPI's been working on a similar track for the last several years. So this presentation today brings together our learnings from CAPI's four-pronged policy research program and dialogues, namely prosperity through improved efficiency and conserving natural capital, development of green growth technologies, practices, increased trade, and adding value to products. More information on all those can be found on the CAPI website for those who are interested. There are major forces of change at work, and we will try to cover a few of the more important ones. The pandemic highlighted how animal and human health connections can determine socioeconomic health, and therefore need for industry strategies, government policies, and regulations to take on a more One Health approach. As Canada's agri-food sector is heavily dependent on trade, we will look at how geopolitical conflict has disrupted our trade flows and investments, with the knock-on effect of increasing global emissions by encouraging tropical deforestation, and examine how climate change and environmental degradation have negative impact on global productive capacity, which combined with pandemic and geopolitical disruption of trade has increased global food insecurity. We will use a One Health approach as we seek to understand the forces affecting strategy and policy at the nexus of trade, climate change, and food security. Food security requires 3 A's: availability of food, accessibility of food, and affordability of food. Domestically, in a non-pandemic environment, food security in Canada is largely an income issue, with the exception of northern communities, where security of Indigenous food sources is challenged by climate change and the threat of animal disease, specifically chronic wasting disease. Food security from a Canadian agriculture perspective is a global food security issue, as Canada is a massively surplus producer. But from a processed food perspective, we are underdeveloped and not as resilient as one would wish. As the graphic indicates, innovation and trade has been key to feeding more people, but it has also created significant One Health problems. Example, climate change, pesticide residue, antimicrobial resistance, eutrophication, and groundwater decline. With the introduction of mechanization in the late 1800s, an acre of land produced enough food to feed 26 people. With the end of World War II, and ammonium nitrate was no longer needed for bombs, and the Green Revolution took off. With the introduction of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, hybrid seeds, and irrigation, allowing an acre of farmland to feed 155 people, with a world population then of 3 billion. The introduction of precision agriculture meant each acre could produce enough food to feed 265 people, with a world population now of 5.3 billion. However, by 2050, farmers will need to produce enough food to feed a world containing 9.7 billion people, which translates into 450 people per acre of farmland. And we must do this with less land, fewer inputs, and 70% less greenhouse gas. Success for further intensification of production will depend on the sustainability of future practices and technology. The World Resource Institute in 2018 report titled Creating a Sustainable Food Future identified the role of new technologies and innovation for improved productivity and increased efficiency of natural resource use as a key factor for producing 56% more calories to feed the 9 billion people while lowering emissions. The first three columns of the graphic indicate agriculture greenhouse gases in gray for 2010, emissions increases if no further productivity gains occur in yellow, and reduction in ag emissions if we can maintain historical rates of productivity in green. The remainder of the chart simply references other ways to move to neutrality. So maintaining the current rate of productivity gains is critical. CAPI has coined this, producing more and better with less, which we refer to as sustainable intensification. The issue is, can we maintain or increase the pace of productivity gains by developing and adopting breakthrough technologies? And I would say, learning from Chris, bundles, that we must bundle this. Unfortunately, climate change is looming large as a risk factor for future productivity gains. For much of the world, current research indicates climate change is already canceling out years of productivity gains, indicated in the graphic in degrees of red, with countries in tropical and semi-tropical areas faring the worst. Canadian agriculture, due to its northerly climate, has not been negatively affected by climate change and has thus far maintained productivity gains. Studies also indicate that agriculture productivity is slowing due to public and private investment in R&D having slowed, despite the fact that the World Bank reports that yearly 600 billion of global domestic agriculture subsidies encourage unsustainable practices and negative environmental externalities. The World Forum Annual Global Risk Survey shows many of the risks with the greatest impact and likelihood directly affect agriculture production. Some of those in the extreme upper right quadrant include infectious disease, climate action failure, biodiversity loss, natural resource crisis, including soil and water, and extreme weather. As this graphic indicates, there are a number of countries with growing water stress, which is increasingly a food security problem. On average, agriculture accounts for 70% of global freshwater withdrawals. With the additional demand for food, the FAO projects water demand could increase by 50% by 2050. But that would severely short other societal demands for water in a growing list of countries. Loss of agricultural soil and biodiversity are also problems that need solutions for agriculture to be sustainable. And then there is disease. The pandemic underscored the fact that infectious disease, including zoonotic threats, are not only human health, but socioeconomic threats. There's a clear correlation between farm animal densities shown on the hog and poultry maps and African swine fever and avian flu outbreaks. The intensification of agricultural production without innovation increases the risk of negative externalities. Plant and animal disease risks need to be evaluated with the lens of impacts on human health, food security, trade, and socioeconomic well-being. The deans of Canadian faculties of agriculture and veterinary medicine have put together some compelling recommendations around the One Health approach in this regard, and I recommend everybody have a look at them. As the dean's suggestions, we will need to rapidly adopt innovation around the phytobiome, microbiome, robotics, mRNA vaccines, big data, AI, and much more flowing from the fourth industrial revolution to feed an increasing population better, sustainably. The key to success will be, as the graphic shows, an integrated approach that encompasses training, education, interdisciplinary research, and collaborative communication. Each of these components drives and improves the others and assures uptake and a wider consumer acceptance. It will not be sufficient to just be an early adopter of agriculture innovation. We must lead in standards development and innovation dissemination globally. 92% of all greenhouse gases related to agriculture arise in the developing countries, including China, caused by technology, knowledge, and investment lag, and by negative effect of land use change. As the dairy efficiency graphic on the right indicates, the US and the EU, with only 14% of the dairy cattle, produce 43% of the milk, while Brazil, India, and China, with 73% of the dairy cows, produce only 37% of the milk. Imagine the change if the developing world had fewer cows, but more milk and less need for feed and far fewer emissions. The value of Canadian agriculture production has more than doubled since 2007 in constant 2007 prices. While greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture activity remain stable, resulting in a decline in greenhouse gas emissions intensity, most due to reduced till, cover crops, introduction of 4Rs, and vast improvements in the efficiency of meat and milk production. Primary agriculture is well set to supply emissions credits and is ready for public and private partnerships, developing trusted carbon accounting and certification systems as the key to broadly successful emissions trading systems. Processors are moving towards carbon neutrality, adopting new technologies and practices, but clearly also ready to buy credits. To put the green growth into perspective, Canadian agriculture accounted for 8.1% of total greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. This is lower than the global agriculture greenhouse gases, which run 10 to 12%. Canada performs much better than the global average when forestry and land use changes are included in the calculation, as this is where the IPCC counts for gains and losses in carbon sequestration under the heading Agriculture, Forestry, and Land Use Changes, known as AFOLU. AFOLU accounted for 23% of total global emissions in 2019, whereas in Canada, the forestry and land use was actually positive for carbon by 25 million tons, bringing Canada's AFOLU to 7.8% compared to the global average of 23%. A strong indicator of sustainability of the Canadian agriculture. The fact that 50% of our agriculture production is exported indicates Canadian agriculture is contributing to global food security with low greenhouse gas intensity products and to climate change solutions. However, it is easy to destroy progress on climate change and food security when global leaders disrupt the global food trade for political gain, as was exemplified by the geopolitical conflict between the US and China that resulted in China diverting its soybean imports from the US to Brazil in 2019. The outcome of this trade diversion is still being felt. First, environmental, as it requires an additional 12.9 million hectares of land use change in Brazil just to replace the US beans, bringing an increase in global carbon emissions. The second, socioeconomic, as food prices in Latin America rose dramatically, increasing poverty and food insecurity. This example highlights how closely trade, environmental sustainability, food security, and profitability are connected. In the case of meat protein, production is so skewed to China, which has about half the hogs in the world, that any large shortfall cannot readily be filled by trade. Since African swine fever, China has been importing about a third of the global meat exported from world meat exporters, and world meat exporters becoming reliant on Chinese market. While over 80% of the Canadian meat plants and many Australian plants are under political suspension by China, causing significant trade diversion. China is uncompetitive in cattle and hog raising and has a high CO2e footprint, making the decision to increase their meat self-sufficiency and increase sourcing from some South American countries incompatible with the goal of global carbon neutrality. And unfortunately, an example of the rule-based multilateral system being replaced by power-based bilateral arrangements, creating investment and food security uncertainty. Sticking with the trade theme for a moment, A great deal of global trade ignores significant externalities, which will lead to food security crises. For many countries, agriculture is tied to groundwater depletion. In fact, 11% of the global agriculture exports are entirely dependent on groundwater depletion embedded in the food traded. The countries with significant groundwater depletion and food exports at risk are shown on the left of the graphic, and the largest importers of virtual water on the right, and that includes Canada. When the wells run dry, those food sources will be gone. But well-intentioned efforts to reduce agriculture emissions can also have unintended consequences. Various initiatives have been introduced to address climate change policies. The European Union's Green Deal includes reductions in land use, reductions in antimicrobials, fertilizers, and pesticides, which, unless offset by a big jump in productivity, will result in lower output. Studies suggest this will lead to offshoring environmental damage and increased greenhouse gases from importing millions of tons of crops and meat produced with higher carbon intensity and tropical forest destruction. The Nature article graphic shown calls into question the logic of the EU biofuels industry incenting land use change with tropical oil crop imports, driving climate change and threatening food security. USDA ERS modeling finds similar results for the EU plans, including global food price increases and worsening global food security. In addition to this, the EU will require a carbon border adjustment mechanism to keep from being overrun with lower cost imports. The chart you were looking at was presented by the OECD to the WTO meeting in 2019 and sums up the future of global food trade. I'm going to quote from the chart because it's so simplistic. Regions with abundant resources will export more to regions with scarce land and water and high population pressure. End of quote. We need to understand that Asia, Africa, and the Middle East will become more food deficit, and the Americas will be the strategic food resource. As the chart on the left indicates, we're one of the most agriculture and food export dependent countries, with much of our exports being raw commodities for primary production. Canada needs to leverage its strength and boost its value-added processing capacity and benefit from opportunities to meet growing global demand for food. This will require investment in value-added capacity, as the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food recommended in their recent report on food processing. This map delineates areas of food surplus and deficit as a percentage of food imports and domestic food supply measured in calories. Food security was top of mind for many countries before African swine fever and COVID. But as the economic power of the E7, the emerging economies of China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, and Turkey are projected to be double the size of the G7 by 2040, the map will grow more red. Household incomes in many Asian countries, as per the chart on the right, will grow far faster than the Western world, driving a demand for value-added processed foods. According to a number of studies listed in your handout, Canada has a strong positive reputation internationally, but we need to turn that into more investment and value-added agriculture and food products. So what is missing? Clearly, if we are to compete globally, increased scale is needed. With barely 1% of our food processing companies with over 500 people, we have a problem. We need to become great at scaling niche businesses. One example that stands out is chilled pork. We were the first outside Asia to do it, and we have simply kept on getting better to the point where we have a greater market share in the most valuable market, Japan, than the Americans, with over 5 times more hogs to draw on than we do. Creating hard to copy desired niche products and developing sustainability as a competitive advantage differentiator will be increasingly important. Finally, the share of processed food imports in Canada's food consumption, has doubled from 15% in 1992 to 30% in 2020. This is an economic issue, and the pandemic reminded us this can become a food security issue for Canada. Trade follows money, and as we have shown, wealth is shifting. As we discovered with the pandemic, processing can reduce dependence on imported food while providing an alternative to commodity export. Now, it's time to put you to work. We have 4 slides with some preliminary conclusions that prompt a number of questions that CAPI is hoping to have answers to better inform our advice to industry and government. Each breakout group will work on the questions in one of the first 3 conclusion slides and the general question on the 4th slide. We will share the results in a synthesis report at the Big Solutions Forum public webinar on May the 20th. And the chair of your breakout group will take you through your questions, but I will quickly cover the preliminary conclusions. So conclusions for question 1 set. Sustainable intensification is essential for future growth and food security. Climate, animal, and plant disease risk loom large for productivity, food security, human health, and socioeconomic health. Adapting a One Health approach to R&D, innovation, regulatory, and policy development is critical to securing the future prospects of the sector. Conclusions for question set number 2. Sustainable agri-food supply chains are essential for resilience of all sectors participants and domestic food security. Growth in the value-added capacity will require right business conditions to attract investments and the right sustainability standards and metrics. Canada's past successes can be repeated for high-value products with characteristics demanded by markets. And conclusions for question set 3. Rural-based trade is essential to growth of sustainable production of food security and food security. Different countries' climate change policies have potential of further distorting global trade. The current geopolitical climate requires new approaches for global solutions. Alliances with like-minded countries and or adding or strengthening environmental chapters in regional and bilateral agreements. One example, being prepared for market-based solutions, which will require public-private partnerships to build trust in standards and markets, could be another. And finally, the conclusion that we'll all work on, the 4th one. The Canadian agri-food system has great potential and the capacity to contribute to sustainable food production, global food security, and climate change solutions while improving its competitive advantage. The biggest and relatively untapped opportunity is in our ability to use multidisciplinary knowledge to create solutions. So as we go to our groups, we'll leave you with this little cartoon that CAPI used in a presentation several years ago. And unfortunately, as you can see, sometimes the things we work on come true. So I'll leave it there and turn it back over to Tyler.
Thank you, Ted. Now we're looking forward to getting to our discussion groups and digging deeper into those questions that CAPI has outlined. As Ted mentioned, each breakout group has been randomly assigned 1 set of conclusions and the corresponding questions to discuss over the next hour. Every breakout group will then be asked to consider the 4th set of questions around those high-level policy areas. Each group will have a chair to guide discussions and a note taker present. In a few moments, you will be moved to a breakout room. If you see a prompt inviting you to join that breakout room, please accept it. After the breakout group discussions, we will meet back in this main room for closing remarks. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. So welcome back, everyone. I hope everybody had an engaging dialogue. You know, we certainly didn't have enough time to cover all all of the questions, or not all of the questions. There weren't many questions, but there was a lot of discussion underneath them, and I think we covered a lot of ground in our group, and I look forward to taking these conversations forward. So tomorrow, the chairs and note takers and CAPI staff are going to reconvene. We're going to try and distill all of the insights that we heard, any of the recommendations that came out of the discussions, and combine them together into a synthesis report. So we're going to take the ideas and strategies and actions, again, that came out of the discussion today, and put it into a synthesis report. The report then will be presented at the final day of our Big Solutions Forum. So on the 20th of May, we hope to see you all again. We'll start the 20th off with a discussion around the synthesis report, what we heard, what the feedback that came out of today was. And then we'll get a reaction and a discussion from panelists, including federal deputy ministers representing agriculture, environment, health, and innovation, and science and economic development, and then a variety of industry leaders representing primary production, food processing, and new technologies and new innovations that are going to come and respond to the synthesis report based on the research that we've done over the last year and the valuable insights that we've had today. If you haven't already registered for the event on the 20th, please go to the forum website, www.thebigsolutionsforum.ca. Again, as the synthesis report is finalized and made public and all pulled together, that's where you can go to find that information. Again, thank you very much for participating today. If you have any questions or would like to carry on these conversations, please feel free to reach out to the CAPI team at any time. We look forward to carrying on the dialogue with you, and we hope to see you on the 20th of May. Thank you very much, and have a great day.